I think he saw a vision. We'll come back. So 1 Corinthians 15 is a creed. I would grant you, I think, Habermas likes to date it around 3. I think it's probably closer to what you said, which is, 5 to 10. And we get that from the approximate date where we think that Paul visited Peter. That's probably what you think, right? That when Paul visited Peter as described in Galatians, that's where he
I think they figure, so Peter's like on his way to, or Paul's on his way to Damascus, and then about 3 years later, he goes to visit Jerusalem after he gets saved. And we figure by then he has to have received the creed. At least that's the timeline that he gives in Galatians. A timeline which the dating of which doesn't seem like it's anything other than him just accounting, here's where I went, here's what I did. So
right.
that would mean
so
within 3 years of his
and I'll grant you that. So within 5 to 10 years, people believed this. But I think it's a mundane claim to say that people believed something that was not necessarily true, or they couldn't actually know whether or not it was true. So let's go through the people who there. So Cephas, that's actually one that for those who don't know, Cephas is another word for Peter. You would agree with that, right? Another name for Peter?
Yeah.
So he appeared to Peter, who is the one person who I think, is either delusional or mistaken or lying or whatever. And then to the 12. Now, what I was talking about is we don't really have good records of what happened to the 12. So it's very possible that, I don't know. This is what people believed. And then appeared to more than 500, which a lot of people talk about, well, this says that it appeared to 500, but we're talking about really, it's very easy for a story to claim that 500 people saw something. So, for example, I live in a large city. We have over 1 million people. But if I said, you know what, last night, Rolling Stone, let me pick something. There was a big concert right outside of town, and 500 of us were there, and it was amazing. There was this great concert that 500 of us were there. If you don't believe me, go and talk to some of the people, because most of them are alive, because it just happened yesterday. How would you possibly, even in the internet age, how would you possibly go and find those 500 people? And if they didn't exist, if I made the whole thing up, how could they possibly stand up and say, well, no, I didn't see the concert? I could find 1 million people that said they didn't see the concert, but that would still leave this claim that there were 500 that did. Like, it just doesn't seem like a great claim.
Okay. So maybe your hypothesis is that what Paul is doing is he's saying, like Peter, who you say definitely thought he saw Jesus. There was like an appearance thing going on there, at least in his head. Paul definitely believes he did, but you're saying that the 500 is just a lie.
A lie or a mistake, yeah. Well,
okay. And then now, if I grant you,
go ahead, finish. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. If I grant you the 500 and we just set that off the table, and we say, hey, let's focus on the 12. So the appearance to the 12 is attested in 1 Corinthians. It's also consistently in all 4 of the Gospels. And you say it's not in Mark, but it's actually it's not narrated in Mark. But at the end of Mark, we have the statement that Jesus will appear to Peter and the 12 and the rest of the disciples, that he's going to appear to them. And so there's a group appearance. Now, I think that a historian would look at Mark and say, Mark is writing after the fact. He's alluding to what was already a tradition going around at the time, which was that Jesus had appeared to a group of his disciples, which included the 12. And then we have Mark, Luke, and John that are all consistent. Now, even if you think they're fabricating some of the details, I feel like you've got to at least admit that there was something that happened where 12 guys said that they saw Jesus, or I should say the 12. Well, the 12 is a title for those particular guys.
But that's interesting. So, well, first of all, I think, the fact that it's in Mark actually just helps my case in that, the other Gospels borrowed so heavily from Mark. Of course they want to finish that. The fact that Mark had that weird abrupt ending, I think you'd agree with me that the ending that is in most Bibles of Mark, isn't the true ending of Mark, right? Like, Mark really, the original manuscripts ended with the women saying they weren't going to talk to anyone. Again, verse 9, 16:9.
I think that Mark doesn't end in a verse; it ends in a story, and you shouldn't read the last verse and act like that's the ending of Mark. But no, I do think, at least at the moment, I do think that the last verses that are in most Bibles in Mark are not original. I think they're constructed from Luke and Acts and the different. passages there. But the ending of Mark doesn't really mean that they didn't tell anybody ever. And I think it's a little silly when people say that.
Well,
We can talk about that if you like.
The only reason it's not silly is because the other Gospels talk about them immediately turning around and running to find Peter. Like they immediately talk about and so you have Mark saying,
which is what Mark implies,
not to tell anybody. So I mean that's but sorry, I lost track of what we were talking about. So we were talking about whether the 12, we're going to talk about Peter and 12, which is really just a few more since Judas was dead. We don't have stories about the individual 12 though. Even going out, like we don't have great stories of them until like the 4th century of what each of them supposedly did afterwards. We don't know for sure that they were going around.
We have 1st century stories of the 12. Absolutely, yeah. That's what the Gospels. That's what.
Okay, sorry.
Matthew, Luke, and John record stories of the 12. 1 Corinthians 15 is a story of the 12 from within 5 years. These are 1st century records, and that's why. But this creed the vast majority.
The creed is what, but even the vast majority will tell you that creed that Paul was reciting, Paul couldn't attest to it. All Paul could do, he wasn't there, so all he was doing was repeating what other people believed. Just like if I was telling people, this is what Mike believes, it's not like I can attest to it. He's just repeating what he was given.
But I didn't use it in the sense of saying, therefore it's true. Right? We're saying, okay, like a historian looks at 1 Corinthians 15 and they say, what's the historical core that led to this saying? Well, it comes from Jerusalem, from within 5 years of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And there's a creed, a formalized creed that is going throughout the church that Paul reports to us that we can trace back to that time and place, that is saying that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12, and then over 500 at once, and to James, and finally, last of all, he appeared to Paul. Now, I think that is strong evidence that the early moments after the resurrection, we had testimony, I'm saying here, of group appearances of Jesus to his disciples, as not just Peter, but also the group. And if you believe Peter, then it seems like you ought to believe in the group statements as well, because they come from the same source.
The reason I believe in Peter is because I believe that he actually met Paul, and that would have been just too weird if Peter had admitted, I made this all up. I kind of think that probably didn't happen. So you had talked about, or actually wanted to just, that I might need to have an alternate explanation of what some of these things were. So, and part of the reason why I think you want to narrow down the number of people is because it doesn't have, the Bible doesn't have to be a giant conspiracy of even 12 people. If you look at it, it really could just be a few people. One Paul, who I believe was mistaken, and it's possible that Peter was also mistaken. So, I actually looked up a number of studies on post-bereavement hallucinatory experiences. I don't know if you've PBHE. Have you heard of those? So.
Yeah,
that's basically, and there's a great study in 2015 by Castelnuovo. For those in the audience, it's basically when someone has a sensory experience that frequently happens right after a death. It's a bereavement. They see the person who died, and these are people without a history of mental illness. It's just a very common thing when people, and the common symptoms are loneliness, low mood, fatigue, anxiety, cognitive dysfunctioning, and according to a 1993 study on this, about 1/3 of the people who've never had history of mental illness, 1/3 of people report hearing and talking to the person that they've talked to. And I think actually even Steve may have experienced this once. So, again, that's a very mundane thing that there have been millions of reported cases of this. It would be a very mundane claim to say that Peter and or a handful of the others thought they saw Jesus, thought they talked to him. It doesn't take the supernatural to explain why they thought that Jesus was alive.
Can I respond to some of that?
Please.
Okay, so I've heard some of this as well, and the statistics that I read were that about 50% of senior adults in particular who are grieving the loss of a loved one will experience some kind of hallucination. And only about 7% of people will actually have a visual hallucination. The majority of them will be auditory, and they're generally very, very brief. And pretty much in almost none of these circumstances do people go away thinking the person is alive from the dead. They just think they're seeing their deceased loved one. They don't start, thinking, oh, they're back. That's not the normal thing. These, by nature, hallucinations cannot be shared. And that's for those who are following our debate, that's why we're debating over whether there was a group appearance. Because if there was a group appearance of Jesus, that is incredibly strong information that there was a real appearance. Because if I see it and you see it, well, then it's not a hallucination. So it's group hallucinations just don't actually happen. That sort of thing. If it's a group that experiences it, it's because it really was there. that's how you know that you're not hallucinating.
So group hallucinations, obviously, that has been studied. There have been things where people claim it, but I would put forward not group. If we want to say that more than Peter just saw this, there's another phenomenon called mass hysteria. Yeah. Now, mass hysteria is a phenomenon where groupthink starts to take over, where one or more people saying they saw something spreads very rapidly. Now, we know from the way our memories work is that there's been lots of psychological studies where, you can have some person, Bart Ehrman always cites the one where you're proposing to the Pepsi machine. They tell a number, they actually have some people propose to a Pepsi machine, and they have some people just think about whether they did it, and they tell them, and basically most of them end up coming away thinking that they proposed to a Pepsi machine, even if they didn't. There's actually a recent case in 2015 in Europe where there was a woman who thought that that she was being attacked by 7 creatures. She thought maybe they were bears or some kind of creatures, where they ripped open the roof of her car and she had to go to the hospital because of all these wounds. And this is literally 2 years ago. Well, now this you can actually now go and interview nurses and doctors who worked with her who actually affirm her story. But her car was impounded, and there was nothing wrong with the roof, and she didn't have any scratches. But it's just because she implanted this story, and it was so fantastical. It got around the hospital, and it seemed to go like mass hysteria.
So she lied to people, and they believed it. But that wouldn't be a group hallucination.
I think she thought it happened. Like she may have been like, but it doesn't matter. Like mass hysteria is again a well-known.
So do you think the disciples experienced mass hysteria?
Oh, I don't think the actual disciples necessarily were involved in this. We're talking about all these other people who didn't and couldn't have been firsthand witnesses, who heard the stories, and mass hysteria. All of a sudden, you start thinking, "Oh yeah, we saw Jesus alive." Like it doesn't.
So let me respond to that. That's an actual theory, right? So. The thing is, that doesn't fit the data, in my opinion, because what we don't have in the New Testament is everybody sees Jesus, but rather Jesus, for a period of time, appeared to a select group of people. And when they share that story with others, those people don't respond by going, oh, I'm seeing him too right now. Right, Paul even says, last of all, he appeared to me. So there were no more appearances after Paul.
We don't have testimony from any of those people that Jesus
we have the historical record. Yeah, we have Paul himself. We have Peter, who says he was an eyewitness of his glory. We have the reliable.
Right, hold on. There's a little bit of stepping on each other, just a little bit. So let's Mike, go ahead and finish your point, and then Paul.
Sorry, I'll let you finish.
Yeah. So I think that what I'm trying to say here is even though I have a bare bones case, right? Just 3 facts that strongly attest to the resurrection of Christ. That is agreed to by a consensus. And I can read to you a bunch of list of names that Habermas has provided, over 60 different names of guys, including atheists and all this. But that bare bones case is powerful enough that Paul has to deny the consensus of scholarship on the issue, because the fact of multiple eyewitness testimony that just defeats a hallucination theory, that's pretty powerful stuff. So I think that this is very good to get out there and talk about. Yeah.
No, but if you take it aside, like how many people would have had